As the result of a public outcry over a national newspaper sponsoring a young couple who wished to select their child to be, the government has stepped in and has banned them from making that selection until a government-appointed committee has fully examined the matter. To help us examine this issue, I have with me today Ryan and Jennifer Kay and their son Mark, and Dr. John Byrne, who is Professor of Clinical Genetics at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne. Mark, you were selected before birth.
That's right.
And how do you feel about that?
I don't know. I mean, I'm really glad to know that I won't get Friedreich's ataxia because I don't think I'll be able to cope with it. But then again, my Auntie Annie, she had Friedreich's ataxia and she would never have been born.
And Annie lived a full and active life in spite of the Friedreich's ataxia.
That's a matter of opinion.
Can I just say, remember the great painters, El Greco, Toulouse-Lautrec, might never have been born had they been rejected at birth for their own genetic conditions. Many artists, great thinkers, scientists would have been lost to us forever on the basis of a pre-birth value judgment of their less than perfect bodies.
So in effect what you're saying is that you find it quite acceptable to condemn an individual to a lifetime of avoidable suffering purely on the grounds that they might produce some great work of art? Do you think my sister, given the choice, would have chosen a life of disability just so those around her could say how wonderful she was?
So, Dr. Kay, you obviously think this couple should be allowed to select out the gene for Friedreich's ataxia?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think we're able to change the world, but we can, with the help of science, influence the lives of individuals. And I think if these changes make our lives longer, make our children's lives longer, healthier and free from suffering, then that can only be for the good.
But don't you think that your wife...
Ex-wife.
I'm sorry, don't you think that Jennifer has a point?
No. I've seen the effects of a hereditary genetic condition at first hand. That's why I do the work I do. And I think that if this couple have the opportunity to avoid needless suffering for themselves, their children and the rest of their family, then I don't think anyone has the right to stand in their way.
But Jennifer, you agreed to the selection of your son Mark. Why are you now so against it?
I feel that technology and some parts of the medical profession are moving too fast and too far, opening up choices that people actually don't want to make. The responsibility's too great. Life's too complicated already. I mean, how can you make these life and death choices without the fear that you might be wrong?
Well, surely it's a greater wrong to allow a suffering when you know you have the ability to stop it.
Look, don't think I don't feel for this couple. Don't think I don't understand how difficult it is for them to make up their minds. But I am concerned about the technology of genetic selection. I mean, when we start to think of some embryos as better than others, then we are rejecting the idea of imperfection. Shouldn't we instead be striving to create a better world to live in, politically, socially, culturally? A world where variety and differences are encouraged and people are accepted for who they are.
So you would have been happy if I was born with Friedreich's ataxia?
No, Mark, of course not. That's the last thing in the world I would have wanted. But if I knew then what I know now, I may have preferred to adopt a child or not to have had a child at all.
Mark, what do you feel about this couple being allowed to select out for Friedreich's ataxia?
I think they should be allowed to do it, but I think there should be someone or some committee somewhere to keep a grip on what people should be allowed to select out. I think it should only be serious diseases.
So you think there should be a government-appointed committee of experts who decide what choices people should be allowed to make?
Yes.
At this point, I'd like to go over to our expert, Professor Byrne.
It's interesting listening to the family debate this because they illustrate the fundamental problem that people differ in their opinions fundamentally, and there isn't really right and wrong on both sides. People can see both points of view. Ryan lived with Friedreich's ataxia. It's an awful disease, and therefore he comes from a position of doing anything to avoid it. Whereas Jennifer quite rightly argues that if you then go too far down that path, then any difference becomes unacceptable. I think the argument about El Greco and the artists is a fairly weak one. I mean, every time a couple decide to use contraception, tens of millions of potential people are not conceived. And I think, you know, we can get lost in a philosophical debate there. But I think, nevertheless, we have to recognise that people can have an impairment and yet still be valuable people. We kind of have to work both ways at once. We have to face both ways at once, and that's the difficulty. We have to love the people who exist with impairments, and yet it's perfectly reasonable to avoid it happening again. I mean, I think all children who ride bikes should wear helmets, but that doesn't mean I think any less of those who are paralysed in an accident. They're two separate arguments. The question of having a committee worries most people. They don't like the idea of committees deciding what should and shouldn't be done. Yet we have a long tradition in this country of finding the sensible middle way. And I think that now that we've got this technology that allows us to test for many diseases all at the same time, we have to decide what should be on the panel and what should not be on the panel. And obviously, the opinion of families and people like Ryan who've experienced diseases helps us to decide what's a severe disease and worth testing for, and what really isn't severe enough to justify testing.
Thank you, Professor Byrne.